So today we're going to be looking at how to create a table in Microsoft Word for all future data papers. So first, you probably have your page with your write-up. This is my write-up. It was perfect. Now it's complete. So let's pretend this was the page your write-up is on. Ideally, you want your table to be on a separate page from your write-up, especially because often you'll want the page to be oriented in landscape mode or horizontally instead of in portrait mode or vertically. So in order to do that, first you have to click on Insert and then Break, and you want to do a section break. That's what allows you to change the orientation of the next page. And that'll bring you to a new page in Microsoft Word. Then I'm going to go over to Layout and change the orientation to Landscape. And you'll see that now my first part, the write-up, is still in Portrait. And the second part, where I'm going to make my table, is now in Landscape mode. So now I'm ready to create my table. I'm going to go over to Tables, and I'm going to tell Microsoft Word that I want my table to have, let's see, if this was my race ethnicity column or table from last week, I would have the 6 race ethnicities and then a 7th column for the variable names. And I'll start off with something like 8 rows. One thing I want to remember, let's see, I was double spaced earlier. I now want my table to be single spaced. I also want to make sure I'm using the correct font. So I'm going to come down and select Courier New. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is create a name for my table, which means I'm going to merge these cells. And I'll call this Table 1, associations between child, race, ethnicity. Now let's call it kindergartner, race, ethnicity, and various academic and demographic factors. I don't know, something like that. I'm going to want to bring this in so that it's not under Table 1, and now that's ready. Now down the left side, I'll have some of my variables, so maybe poverty status, that was one of them. Underneath poverty status, I'm going to indent and have percent below poverty threshold. And don't worry, I'm going to fix all of this. Percent between poverty threshold and 200% of poverty threshold. And then at or above poverty threshold. So obviously I'm going to have to make my left column much wider, which is going to mean kind of playing around with my remaining columns. I'll move this over a bit. There's just a lot of playing with the columns that happens when you're making these tables. Whoop. Make sure they're all together. All right, there's no way I'm going to fit all of that on one line. I'll come over here and I'll again indent that second line only. Make sure the top line is aligned with the rest. Beautiful. All right, so it's going to look something like that. And then I want to make sure that these columns are now evenly spaced. So I'll highlight all of the remaining columns and click Distribute Columns. Let's do these two. Now my columns are evenly spaced and I can start adding all the racial ethnic categories. Let's add insert a row. So my first will be white, and I have black, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, any race, Caucasian, Native American, and multiracial. Look like they kind of adjusted there, so let's just make sure they're even again. Ooh, that's yucky. Okay, so we play with this again. Very good. Even these out again. It's a lot of back and forth. Move that over that much. There we go. And now all I have to do is fix this final guy. Beautiful. So now I can actually start putting my numbers into the table. So for whites, it was 12.76%, 19.41, 67.82, etc. So I'm going to do these for all of my variables. And what's important is you want to make sure your variables are, or your decimals are aligned. Usually, I like to take all of my numbers and make sure they are centered in the table. So I'll kind of go back and do that. But that means they won't automatically be aligned. So for example, if this number was 1.60 and this was 12.45, you'll notice my decimal points are not all aligned when I do that. So I actually have to come over to this one and give it an extra space because it was not as many digits as the rest. And that's how I make sure those decimal points are aligned. The same will be true if you have a negative number. You're going to probably have to play around with the spacing a little bit. And then your last step, once you have your numbers in the table, just make up some numbers in here, etc. Your last step is to get rid of the lines you don't need and then draw on the lines you do. I find it's easiest just to get rid of all my lines. So now they're gone. And then I come over to tables and lines, draw, let's see. And I can draw one line under the title of the table. I'm going to draw another line under my my categories. And then I will draw a final line underneath my table. So this would be underneath the last row of my table. Whoops. There it goes. And then after I've made my line under my last row of the table, that's where I can put any notes about my table. And I want to make sure that they're in the same format as the rest of my table. That's where I could put any p-values if they were appropriate for my table. And that's pretty much it. So that is how you go about making your tables in Microsoft Word. I highly recommend that you keep them on a separate page like this. If you're really having a hard time in terms of spacing, you can play around with margins a little bit. But this is really how you want to do it. Let me know if you have any questions. Hope this can be helpful.